His wife left him sick on a hospital bed, walked in dressed for lunch, dropped divorce papers on his tray table, and walked back out without once asking how he was feeling. She had already found her replacement, a flashy, scripture-quoting private equity man with a Range Rover and a reputation built on borrowed credibility. She was so certain she was trading up that she never stopped to ask a single question about the quiet man she was leaving behind. That was her first mistake. Her last mistake would come later, in a house on a street she never cared about, when she finally learned that the man she had dismissed as small was the silent heir to a $2 billion empire, and that the entire world her new rich lover had built, his office, his construction loan, his reputation, his future, had been running, unknowingly, on the foundation of the man she left with an IV in his arm. What happens when everything you thought you were escaping turns out to be the very thing your new life was built on? If this story is already pulling you in, do us a favor right now. Hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because we are just getting started. And we want to hear from you today. Drop your city in the comments right now. Where in the world are you watching from? Now let me take you the way back to a Tuesday morning in New Orleans, room 214 of Tulane Medical Center, where a man named Calvin Bro opened his eyes after 3 days unconscious and waited quietly for his wife to walk through the door. Calvin Bro had been unconscious for 3 days when he finally opened his eyes. The ceiling of room 214 was the first thing he saw, white, flat, indifferent, and for a long moment he simply looked at it, letting the world reassemble itself around him. The beeping of the monitor, the thin pull of the IV line in the crook of his left arm, the particular stillness of a hospital room at mid-morning, when the breakfast trays have been collected and the next round of checks is still an hour away. He was alone. That was the first thing he noticed, not the tube, not the soreness in his chest, not the papery gown that had twisted around him while he slept. The aloneness. Celeste's chair, the one beside the bed, the one that was supposed to hold a coat, a purse, a half-eaten bag of chips from the vending machine down the hall, was empty. The surface of his tray table held only a cup of apple juice with a bent straw, a small paper cup of pills he had not yet taken, and his phone, screen dim. He waited. He told himself she was in the cafeteria, getting coffee, stretching her legs. He told himself the things a man tells himself when the alternative is too large to hold, before he has had a chance to sit up straight. Calvin Bro was 51 years old. He was an accountant with a small, steady practice in the Treme, the kind of man who knew every one of his clients by name and kept their files in a system he had built by hand over 20 years. He was a church trustee and a food pantry volunteer, and the person the neighbors called when a pipe needed looking at, and they didn't have money for a plumber. He was not a man who required much. He had never required much. He had believed, in the quiet way he believed most things, that a man who asked for little and gave generously would not find himself with nothing. He was still forming that belief into something coherent when he heard heels in the hallway. Celeste came through the door at 11:14. He knew the time because his phone lit up when she pushed it open, and he saw it in the corner of the screen before he saw her face. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of burnt amber and heels that added 2 inches she did not need, and her hair was laid and her earrings caught the fluorescent light. She was dressed the way she dressed when she wanted to be seen somewhere that mattered. She was not dressed for a hospital. She set her bag on the chair beside the bed. She did not sit down. She looked at him the way you look at something you have already decided about. There was no relief on her face, no exhale of a woman who had been frightened and was now reassured. There was only a particular kind of composure, the composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was now simply executing it. She reached into her bag and placed a manila envelope on the tray table next to the apple juice and the pills and his phone. She placed it deliberately, without rushing, and she smoothed the edge of it once with 2 fingers as if she were filing something away. Then she told him. 14 months. That was how long she had been seeing Deshawn prior. She said his name the way people say the names of things they are proud of. She said the marriage was over. She said she had loved Calvin the way you love a piece of furniture, reliably, without excitement, and with a growing resentment that it never became anything more than what it was. She said those words in that room, with the monitor beeping and the IV line in his arm, and she said them in the same tone she used to tell him the dishwasher needed emptying. Andre appeared in the doorway then. He had been in the hallway, had been there the whole time, Calvin understood now, waiting his turn like a man at a business meeting. Celeste's brother was 2 years younger than her and 3 times as loud about the things he wanted, and he stepped into the room and told Calvin, without preamble, that the house on Ursuline's Avenue had already been assessed and that Celeste would be filing the paperwork within the week. He did not ask how Calvin was feeling either. Neither of them did. They were in the room for less than 8 minutes. Calvin did not speak. There was nothing to say that would have changed anything, and he understood in the distant way that a man understands things when his blood sugar has only just stabilized, that they had not come for a conversation. They had come to deliver information and depart, which was what they did. Miss Dolores, who had worked the floor of this ward for 19 years and grown up 2 blocks from Calvin on St. Bernard Avenue, was standing in the doorway of the supply room across the hall when they left. She had not moved since Celeste came through the door. She watched them go without a word. Calvin looked at his phone. The wallpaper was a photograph he had taken 4 years ago, the afternoon they cleaned out Ida May's house on the day after her funeral. The frame of it was Ida May's living room, her good chair, her lamp, the gospel calendar she kept on the wall from 1 year to the next. And there, in the background, barely visible between the edge of the doorframe and the shadow of the hallway, was a framed letter. He had never paid it much attention before. He paid it attention now. He could not have said why. He lay there with the manila envelope untouched on his tray table, and the apple juice slowly going warm, and the room completely quiet around him, and he looked at that letter in the background of his mother's living room, and something in him would not let it go. He did not know yet what it meant. He only knew it was there. To understand what that moment would eventually cost Celeste Bro and every person who had stood with her in that room, you have to go back 19 years. You have to go back to when it all began. Calvin Bro met Celeste Fonsworth at a church fish fry on a Saturday in September, 19 years before he woke up alone in that hospital room. She was 29 years old and wearing a yellow dress and laughing at something her cousin had said, and Calvin, who was 32, and had never been the kind of man who spoke first. He introduced himself quietly. She looked at him with her head slightly tilted, the way people look at something they are trying to assess, and she smiled. He thought the smile meant she liked what she saw. He did not yet understand that Celeste Fonsworth was always assessing, and that what she liked about Calvin Bro in that moment was not who he was, but what she believed she could build around him. They married 14 months later at a church on Esplanade Avenue, with potted azaleas lining the aisle and her mother crying in the second pew and the reception spilling out onto the sidewalk the way good New Orleans celebrations always did. Calvin danced badly and laughed at himself for it, and Celeste laughed too, and for a few years that was enough. He was employed, he was faithful, he came home. He fixed the things that needed fixing without waiting to be asked. These were not small qualities. He believed they were the only ones that truly mattered. He was not wrong. He was just married to a woman who had decided otherwise. The incompatibility was not obvious in the early years. It lived beneath the surface of the marriage like a slow crack in a wall, invisible from a distance, easy to ignore up close, dangerous only when you finally look directly at it. Celeste had grown up watching her mother make do, and she had decided at some point, privately and permanently, that making do was a form of failure. She did not want extravagance, she wanted visibility. She wanted to walk into rooms and have people notice what she had built. And for a while she believed Calvin was part of that, a steady professional husband, a Tremé address, a life moving in the right direction. But the direction Calvin moved in was quiet. He built his accounting practice slowly, client by client, reputation by reputation. He joined the church trustee board. He started volunteering at the food pantry on Conti Street every third Saturday, loading boxes in the back of a community centre with men who had known his father and women who had known Ida May. He was present in his neighbourhood the way people used to be present, not performing, not announcing, just there. The community knew him, respected him, called his name when they saw him on the street. Celeste began to find this embarrassing. It happened in stages the way most corrosion does. First, she started comparing. A colleague at her job bought a house in Lakeview. Andre's friend from college just made partner somewhere. Did Calvin ever think about expanding the practice, getting a bigger office? She said these things gently at first, then less gently, and Calvin listened and said he was doing fine and meant it, which frustrated her in a way she could not fully articulate. A man who was content with enough was a man she could not move. And Celeste had always needed to be able to move the people around her. Andre had known about this dynamic for years and done nothing to help it. Celeste's brother was 45 and operated in the aggressive, self-congratulatory register of a man who had confused busyness with success. He had 3 deals always in progress, 2 of which were usually in trouble, and he talked about money the way people talk about weather, constantly, loudly, and with great personal investment in the forecast. He had never liked Calvin. He found Calvin's stillness suspicious, his contentment a sign of low ambition, and his refusal to be impressed by Andre's various ventures a personal affront. He fed Celeste's dissatisfaction the way you feed a fire, not dramatically, just steadily, making sure it never went out. The cruelties became specific. At a dinner party with 2 other couples whose husbands were a contractor and a dentist, Celeste made a remark about Calvin's office being in a building that needed new windows. She laughed when she said it. The other women laughed too. Calvin smiled and said nothing. Later that night, washing dishes while Celeste watched something in the next room, he stood at the sink for a long time with the water running and thought about whether the remark had been unkind or whether he was being too sensitive. He decided he was too sensitive. He turned off the water and went to bed. That was Calvin Bro. He talked himself out of every wound. He noticed the distance growing and he prayed over it, the way Ida May had taught him to pray over things he could not fix, quietly, without demanding an answer. He worked his tax seasons, he attended his trustee meetings. He brought Celeste her coffee in the morning, the way he had for 11 years. He told himself that all long marriages had these seasons, that what looked like contempt was just fatigue, that a man who showed up was a man who was doing his part. He kept showing up. He did not know he was the only one still trying. Then Andre went to a real estate investment seminar in Houston, and he came back with someone. Miss Dolores came by on a Thursday, 6 days after the hospital discharged Calvin into a house that felt 3 sizes too large. She brought a covered plate, smothered chicken, rice, a square of cornbread wrapped in foil, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things for a while. The ward, a patient she'd had that week, the heat that had been sitting over the city like a wet blanket since mid-September. Calvin ate slowly and said the right things at the right times, and Miss Dolores let the conversation breathe the way women from the Tremé know how to let a conversation breathe. Then, just before she stood to leave, she looked at him with that particular stillness she had and asked if he had anyone looking after his mother's affairs. Calvin told her everything had been settled years ago. The house on St. Bernard had gone into the family trust. The small savings account had been closed out. He had handled it himself, quietly, the way Ida May would have wanted. Miss Dolores looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very simply that she hoped he was sure. And then she picked up her bag and walked to the door, and Calvin thanked her, and she left. He sat at the table for a long time after that. That evening he picked up his phone and looked at his wallpaper photograph the way he had been looking at it in small, stolen moments since the hospital. Ida May's living room, the good chair, the lamp, the gospel calendar. And there, in the background, tucked between the edge of the doorframe and the shadow of the hallway, the framed letter. He had walked past that letter 10,000 times. He had never once read it. He zoomed in with 2 fingers until the image pixelated at the edges. The signature was clear, James Arsenault. Calvin set the phone down on the table. He did not move for several minutes. Then he got up, found his keys, and drove to his storage unit on Elysian Fields Avenue. The unit was a 10 by 10 space that smelled like cardboard and old wood, stacked with the carefully labelled boxes of a man who had inherited a mother's entire life and not yet found the right time to fully reckon with it. He found the box he was looking for on the 3rd row. It said "Kitchen" in his own handwriting in black marker, the letters slightly uneven the way handwriting gets when your hands are not quite steady. Ida May's Bible was inside, wrapped in a dish towel printed with yellow sunflowers. He carried it to the folding chair by the storage unit door and sat down under the fluorescent light of the corridor. He held the Bible in both hands for a moment. Then he opened it, not to any particular page, just let it fall open. And it opened, as Bibles do that have been loved in a specific place for a long time, to the place it had been opened most often, somewhere in the Psalms. He turned toward the back, moving carefully, feeling for something that didn't belong among the pages. Between 2 Corinthians and Galatians, pressed flat and slightly yellowed at the edges, was an envelope. He opened it. The document inside was 2 pages, typed on letterhead from 1987, notarized at the bottom of the 2nd page with a seal that had gone faint but was still legible. Calvin read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you can't quite believe what you're reading. Then he read it again, slowly. Ida May Bro, $40,000. A 12% equity interest in all future Arsenault commercial ventures, in perpetuity. Signed by both parties, witnessed by 2 names he didn't recognize, notarized by a woman named Sandra Turod, dated March 14th, 1987. The year Calvin was 16 years old. He sat in that folding chair for a long time. Then he called the number on the letterhead. It rang 3 times. A man answered, not a receptionist, not an assistant, the man himself, in a voice that was old and measured and completely awake. Calvin told him his name. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to mean something. Then the man said, "I have been waiting on this call for 5 years, son." They met 2 days later at Arsenault Commercial Group's offices in Baton Rouge, a building on 3rd Street that occupied an entire city block and announced its own weight before you walked through the door. James Arsenault was 79 years old and moved carefully, but held himself like a man who had earned every room he had ever stood in. He shook Calvin's hand with both of his and held it for a moment, and did not say anything at first, and Calvin understood that this was a man repaying a debt that had compounded silently for nearly 4 decades. Renata Cobb was already seated at the conference table when they came in. She was composed in the specific way that sharp attorneys are composed, not cold, just economical with everything, including emotion. She had 2 files in front of her. She opened the first one and walked Calvin through it with the precision of someone who had prepared for this meeting many times in her mind. Arsenault Commercial Group, Current valuation, $2.3 billion. Calvin's stake, 12%. Current worth, approximately $276 million. She explained the equity structure, the perpetuity clause, the legal standing of the original note. She explained that Arsenault had kept her on retainer for this specific contingency for 5 years, ever since it became clear that Ida May had passed without anyone from the Bro family coming forward. Calvin listened without interrupting. He asked 2 clarifying questions. He was steady. Then Renata opened the second file. She said she wanted him to be aware of something else, a matter that had come to her attention when she reviewed the lending arm's current active transactions in preparation for this meeting. She turned the file so Calvin could see it and pointed to a line near the top of the first page. Co-financing partner, Materi Mixed-Use Development, Prior Capital Group. Calvin looked at that name for a long time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when he is not surprised and is also completely surprised when a thing that should be impossible turns out to be not only possible, but already true and already in motion. He did not speak. He just looked at the page, and the room was quiet, and James Arsenault watched him from across the table with the expression of a man who understood that some reckonings arrive slowly and then all at once. Finally, Calvin looked up at Renata. He asked her one question. How long would it take to formally activate the equity position? She said she could file by end of week. Calvin nodded once. Then he closed the file folder with both hands neatly, the way you close something you have fully understood and do not need to look at again. He didn't decide what came next out of anger. He decided because he finally understood what his mother had left him and what it was time to do with it. Calvin returned to Arsenault's offices on Thursday morning with a yellow legal pad and a pen and nothing else. Renata was already at the conference table when he arrived, her files organized in front of her, a fresh legal pad of her own open to the first page. James Arsenault sat at the head of the table. He had coffee waiting. Calvin sat down, set his pad flat on the table, and uncapped his pen. He did not apologize for being direct. He simply began. He told Renata he wanted 4 things. The first was formal recognition of the Bro family equity position, filed immediately. Not pending, not in process. Filed. He wanted the documentation in the public record before the end of business Thursday, so that the equity claim had legal standing from that day forward. Renata made a note without looking up and said it was already drafted and ready for his signature. The second was a full audit of all distributions owed to the Bro family trust, going back to the original agreement date of March 1987. Every distribution that should have flowed to Ida May, and later to her estate, and later to Calvin as her heir. He wanted the accounting complete and the number documented. Renata said she had already begun preliminary calculations and that the figure, when finalized, would be substantial. The third was a legal review of every active transaction in the Arsenault Commercial Group lending arm that involved Prior Capital Group in any capacity, as borrower, co-financer, or guarantor. He wanted that review documented separately and held until he decided what to do with it. The fourth was a letter. He was specific about this one. He wanted it written on Arsenault Commercial Group letterhead. He wanted it signed by James Arsenault personally. And he wanted it to formally notify Prior Capital Group that its co-financing arrangement on the Materi development was under equity holder compliance review and that no further draws would be authorized pending resolution. No explanation of who had triggered the review, no names, just the notice from the institution on official paper delivered to Deshawn Prior's office. Renata looked up then and asked if he wanted anything sent directly to his wife or to Andre Farnsworth. Calvin said no. He said he wanted nothing sent to either of them directly. He said he wanted them to find out the way everyone eventually found out about things that were already in motion, not through a warning, but through consequence. He set his pen down and looked at her steadily and said that he was not interested in confrontation for its own sake. He was interested in accuracy. He wanted the legal record to reflect the truth, and he wanted the truth to do what the truth does when no one is standing in its way. James Arsenault had not spoken during any of this. He sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and his eyes steady. And when Calvin finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Ida May had raised someone who understood the difference between revenge and justice. He said those two things looked the same from the outside and felt completely different from the inside. He said he had been waiting 37 years to honor what she had done for him, and that he considered everything Calvin was asking him to do not a favor, but an overdue debt. He agreed to every item without qualification. The filing was made Thursday afternoon. The letters went out Friday morning, processed through Arsenault's standard correspondence system, addressed to Prior Capital Group at its registered offices on Poydras Street, and to Fondsworth Development LLC at its registered address in Metairie. Both went out in standard business envelopes on Arsenault Commercial Group letterhead, signed by James Arsenault in blue ink, and nothing on either envelope would have indicated to anyone handling it that something irreversible was folded inside. Calvin was on the road back to New Orleans by noon. He drove the 70 miles home with the radio off and the windows cracked and the flat Louisiana landscape moving past him like a thing he had always lived inside and never quite looked at before. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel angry. He felt the particular quiet of a man who has done what needed to be done and has laid it down and is now letting it move. He stopped at the Tremé Community Centre on Conti Street at 2 in the afternoon. It was not his scheduled Saturday, but Sister Vivienne was there with a volunteer crew working through a large food donation that had come in from a church in Metairie, and she waved him in without asking why he had come. He worked for 3 hours. He stacked canned goods, carried boxes, helped 2 younger men load a flatbed cart with rice and cooking oil destined for 3 families on Ursulines Avenue. He talked about nothing important. He laughed once at something Sister Vivienne said. Nobody in that room knew what was riding toward Deshawn Pryor's desk in a standard business envelope. Nobody in that room knew that a man sorting canned peas in a Tremé community centre was the reason that a $47 million construction project was about to become a $47 million problem. Calvin loaded the last box. He washed his hands. He drove home. The letters arrived in Deshawn Pryor's office on Monday morning, and Deshawn Pryor had never received a letter that scared him before. The call came at 7 in the morning on a Monday. Deshawn's project manager, a man named Curtis, who had been running construction sites for 20 years and did not panic easily, called to say that Arsenault Commercial Group's lending arm had issued a formal notification. All draw requests on the Metairie construction loan were suspended, effective immediately, pending resolution of an internal equity holder compliance review. $31 million already drawn. $16 million remaining in the commitment. All of it frozen. Deshawn was still in bed when the call came. He sat up, read the notification Curtis had forwarded to his phone, and told himself it was an administrative error, a clerical problem, something that happened when large institutions ran internal audits and tripped over their own paperwork. He had seen it before. He would make a call, and it would be resolved by noon. He called Andre first. Andre had received the same notification at his registered office address for Fondsworth Development LLC and was already awake and already loud about it. He said it had to be a mistake. He said he had a relationship with Arsenault's lending director. He said he would have it cleared up before the week was out. Neither man had a framework for what was actually happening. They were treating a surgical incision like a paper cut. Andre's attorney called Arsenault's offices at 9 that morning. The woman who answered was polite, precise, and entirely unhelpful. She confirmed that a compliance review was underway related to an internal equity dispute. She confirmed that no further draws would be authorized until the matter was resolved. She could not provide a timeline. She could not provide additional details. She thanked the attorney for calling and ended the call. Deshawn tried his own Arsenault contact, a man named Gerald, who had co-chaired 2 Arsenault Foundation galas with him, and who, Deshawn had always believed, was a personal relationship rather than a professional courtesy. He left a message, calm, assured, the voice of a man who expected to be called back within the hour. Gerald did not call back. By Wednesday, Thibodeau & Sons had made their decision. The general contractor's payment schedule depended on regular draw disbursements, and the Metairie site had now gone 6 business days without one. Their contract included a payment default clause that triggered automatically at 7 days. They did not wait for the 7th. They sent the formal suspension notice Wednesday afternoon and filed $3.8 million in preliminary liens against the Metairie property before the close of business. The construction site went quiet overnight. Equipment sat idle. Workers did not show up Thursday morning. Deshawn spent Thursday on the phone trying to source emergency bridge financing. He had 3 conversations with 3 different lending institutions. Each one pulled the same public filing, the equity review filing that Renata Cobb had submitted on Thursday of the previous week, and each one said the same thing in different language. The title was clouded. Until the equity dispute was resolved, no institutional lender would touch the property as collateral. 3 calls, 3 declines. Andre called Celeste Thursday evening. He had been carrying the anxiety of the week alone, not wanting to alarm her before he had something to fix. And now there was nothing to fix, and he could not carry it alone anymore. He told her the Metairie project had a problem. He said it was temporary. He said the word temporary twice in the same sentence, which was how Celeste knew it was not temporary. She asked him what kind of problem. He told her about the equity dispute. He told her about the frozen loan, the liens, the lenders who had declined. He told her Deshawn was handling it. He said those words, Deshawn is handling it, with a confidence he did not feel. And Celeste was quiet on the other end of the line in a way that meant she heard the gap between what he was saying and what he believed. She had quit her social work position 3 months earlier. She had done it at Deshawn's suggestion, framed as a liberation. Why are you still doing that job when you don't need to? She had no income. She had the life Deshawn was paying for and the future Deshawn had promised, and now her brother was calling to tell her that Deshawn's flagship project had stopped moving. She told Andre to keep her informed and got off the phone. Deshawn did not know about the call between the siblings. He was still in damage control mode, still operating on the assumption that the right conversation with the right person would unlock the whole mechanism. Friday afternoon, he sat at his desk on the 14th floor of the Arsenault-owned building on Poydras Street, $14,000 a month, paid to a company he was about to learn he had always been renting from at someone else's discretion. And he recorded a voicemail for James Arsenault himself. The message was measured, professional. It referenced their shared history with the foundation, their years of association, the significant investment at stake in Metairie. It was the voice of a man who believed that relationships were currency and that he had enough currency to buy his way out of this. He ended the message by saying he was confident they could resolve the matter quickly and that he looked forward to hearing back at Arsenault's earliest convenience. He set down his phone. He was still certain the call would be returned. It was not returned. And then the newspaper called. Calvin chose Ida May's house deliberately. Not a conference room, not a law office with leather chairs and a glass table designed to make everyone feel equally important. He chose the house on St. Bernard Avenue, where Ida May had raised him, a Treme shotgun house that still smelled faintly of the cedar sachets she kept in the closets and the ghost of 10,000 Sunday dinners. The house that was still in the Bro family trust. the house that Celeste had never once set foot in without looking around like she was visiting a place she was glad she didn't live. He wanted that to be the room where it ended. Renata arrived first and set her files on the kitchen table. Celeste came 20 minutes later with her attorney, a composed man named Bertrand, who wore small glasses and spoke in careful, measured sentences. They sat in the front room on chairs that had been Ida May's, and Bertrand opened his folder, and the legal portion of the meeting began. André came through the door 10 minutes after that, uninvited, and Calvin looked at him once and said he could stay. The attorneys talked for 20 minutes. Bertrand laid out Celeste's position. She was seeking clarity on whether the Arsenault equity stake constituted a marital asset, given that its discovery had occurred during the marriage, even if its origin predated it. Renata answered him calmly and precisely, and dismantled every argument without raising her voice. The equity was held by the Bro Family Trust established in Ida May's name in 1987, predating the marriage by 12 years. It had never been a marital asset. It was not subject to division. Bertrand made a note and pushed his glasses up and said he would need to review the trust documentation. Renata slid a copy across the table without being asked. Calvin had been quiet through all of it. He sat in the chair that had been Ida May's reading chair, the one by the window, the one with the worn armrests, and he listened without interrupting. When Renata and Bertrand reached a natural pause, he looked at Renata and asked if he could have a few minutes to say something directly. Renata said of course. He looked at Celeste. She was composed in the way she had always been composed in difficult moments. Spine straight, expression controlled. A woman who had long since decided that showing nothing was the same as feeling nothing. But her hands were folded in her lap a little too tightly, and she hadn't looked directly at Calvin since she walked through the door. He spoke without raising his voice. He said, "You left me with an IV in my arm because you decided I was small. You walked into that hospital room dressed for lunch, and you put papers on my tray table, and you walked out without asking me once how I was." André was in the hallway. "Neither one of you sat down. I want you to understand something. I'm not angry about that anymore. I am telling you that because I want you to understand what you were looking at when you looked at me and decided I wasn't enough." He paused. "You were looking at Ida May's son." The room was completely still. "And Ida May," he said, with $40,000 and a handshake and a piece of paper she kept in her Bible, "built something neither one of you had the vision to see. She gave that money to a man every bank in Baton Rouge had turned away. She didn't ask for collateral. She didn't ask for publicity. She folded the note into her Bible between 2 Corinthians and Galatians, and she trusted God, and she trusted that man, and she went back to work." He looked at Celeste steadily. "Deshawn's office on Poydras Street. He has been paying $14,000 a month in rent to a building I own a piece of. His construction loan on the Materi project, the one that is now in default, came from a lending arm of a company I am a partner in. His reputation in this city, the Arsenault name he has been borrowing for 4 years to make himself look larger than he is. He built that standing next to a man who spent 37 years waiting to put my name where it belongs." He let that sit for a moment. "You didn't leave me for rich, Celeste. You left me for a man who was borrowing from my mother's table. And he didn't even know whose table it was." Celeste did not cry. That was not her way. What happened to her face was quieter and more devastating than tears. It was the specific expression of someone who has just understood, fully and completely, and without any remaining exit, the true geometry of every choice they made, the full architecture of their mistake, visible all at once. She sat with it. There was nowhere to go. André started to speak. He got 3 words out, words that were heading toward outrage, toward some version of "you can't just," and Calvin stood. He buttoned his jacket with 2 slow, deliberate movements. He walked to the window that faced St. Bernard Avenue and he looked out at the street his mother had walked every day of her life on this earth. The oak trees, the afternoon light coming down through them at an angle, a child on a bicycle, an old man on a porch 2 houses down who had known Ida May by name. He stood there until the room behind him was empty. He did not turn around until he could no longer hear footsteps, until the front door had opened and closed, until the house was quiet in the way it had always been quiet when it was only his. He stood at that window for a long time. After that day, the legal proceedings moved quickly, and so did everything else. The divorce was settled in 60 days. Renata handled it with the same clean efficiency she brought to everything. The marital assets were divided according to what was fair, and nothing beyond that at the Ursulines Avenue house, 2 joint accounts, a modest investment portfolio that Calvin had built over years of careful, unglamorous discipline. He did not ask for more than his share. He did not pursue anything punitive. He took what was his and released the rest, the way a man releases something he has already set down in his mind long before the paperwork makes it official. Celeste got the house. She sold it within 3 months. Deshawn could not help her keep it. By the time the divorce finalized, Prior Capital Group was already in the early stages of what would become a complete operational wind-down. The Materi property was declared in formal default and flagged for distressed sale proceedings. A development group out of Baton Rouge acquired it at auction for roughly 30 cents on the dollar, a transaction that cost Deshawn and Andre a combined loss that neither of them would publicly discuss for years afterward. The project that was supposed to make Deshawn Pryor a household name in New Orleans real estate instead became a cautionary footnote that people mentioned in hushed tones at industry dinners. Deshawn left New Orleans quietly, no announcement, no farewell event. 1 month he was there, and the next month his Poydras Street office was dark, and his name had been removed from the building directory. He relocated to Atlanta, where no one knew the Arsenault name the way New Orleans knew it, and where he could begin the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a reputation from scratch without the borrowed credibility that had been propping it up for years. Andre settled his $4 million personal guarantee liability for 60 cents on the dollar after months of negotiation that cost him whatever was left of his professional standing in the city. He relocated to Houston shortly after. He did not call Celeste before he left. Celeste moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Gentilly. The apartment was perfectly adequate and completely invisible. Nothing about it announced itself to the world, which was the thing she had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. She went back to work. She did not remarry. Whatever she had believed she was moving toward when she walked into room 214 with that manila envelope and those heels, it had not materialized, and the life she was living now was quieter and smaller and more honest than anything she had allowed herself during the years she was busy being contemptuous of Calvin's. Calvin did not think about any of them often. Renata finalized the Bro family trust equity position and secured $4.7 million in retroactive distributions, money that should have flowed to Ida May and her estate going back decades, money that the accounting had been quietly owed and never paid. Calvin held that number in his mind for a few days. He thought about what Ida May would have done with it. He thought about the food pantry. He thought about the young woman he had met at the community center the previous November, who had a plan for a Creole spice business and couldn't get a traditional lender to look at her twice. He called Renata and told her he wanted to set $2 million aside. The Ida May Bro Community Fund was established in the fall, just over a year after the hospital. Its purpose was simple: small business loans for entrepreneurs in Treme and the 7th Ward who could not access traditional financing. The application process was straightforward. The interest rates were below market. The only requirement beyond a viable business plan was that the applicant be willing to sit down with Calvin himself for 1 hour and talk through the numbers, because Calvin Bro was still fundamentally an accountant, and he believed that what most people lacked was not the desire to build something, but someone patient enough to help them see that the math was survivable. The fund made 11 loans in its first year. 9 of those businesses were still operating 2 years later. Calvin kept his accounting practice on Rampart Street. He still volunteered at the Treme Community Centre every third Saturday. He still brought his own coffee in a thermos and wore the same kind of unremarkable clothes he had always worn, and the people in his community still called his name on the street with the particular warmth reserved for someone whose presence means something solid and real. In the spring, 14 months after the hospital, Miss Dolores found him after a volunteer shift and asked if he wanted to get coffee sometime. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. No performance, no hesitation, just a direct question from a woman who had known him since he was riding a bicycle on St. Bernard Avenue and had never once pretended to be anything other than exactly who she was. He said yes. They took their time. That was the right way for it. Ida May always said the law don't waste a good foundation. She said it about houses and she said it about people, and she believed both things with equal conviction. Calvin Brough had been a foundation his whole life. Steady, load-bearing, present, the kind of structure that held everything above it in place without requiring anyone to notice. He had been that foundation in his marriage, in his community, in the quiet, faithful labor of his unremarkable days. He just hadn't known yet what was built on top of him. Now he knew. So here is what I want to ask you. Before we close this story out, what would you have done in Calvin's position? When you found out that the man who helped take everything from you had been building his whole world on something that belonged to your mother, would you have done what Calvin did? Would you have been that patient, that precise, that unbothered by rage? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story moved you, if you felt every single one of those dominoes fall the way they were meant to, please hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find stories like this one. We have more coming. Stories about people who were underestimated, overlooked, walked past, written off, and what happened when the world finally caught up to who they actually were. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. Calvin Brough is at rest, and so is Ida May. We'll see you in the next one.